Cowboy entered the gun shop for ammo, came out carrying a widow's secret. Wooden buildings lined either side of the road, their porches bathed in the soft morning light. One building stood out among the rest, a small, unassuming gun shop with a faded sign above the door that read, Harlow's Arms and Ammo. He had been riding the range for years, moving cattle from one ranch to another, always guided by the early light of day. His boots crunched against the gravel, and the soft jingle of spurs announced his presence even before he reached the door. Today, his visit to the gun shop was ordinary, almost routine. He needed ammunition for the next cattle drive, a simple chore in a life that was otherwise defined by hard work and long, quiet days on the open plains. The bell above the shop door rang as Ethan pushed it open. The smell of gun oil, leather, and old wood greeted him immediately, filling his senses with a familiar comfort. Shelves lined with rifles, pistols, and ammunition boxes stretched along the walls. Display cases gleamed under the soft morning light filtering through dusty windows. The shop had been run for years by Mr. Harlow, a man known throughout Dry Creek for his steady hands and calm demeanor. But Mr. Harlow had passed away suddenly a few months back, leaving his widow, Mrs. Harlow, to manage the store alone. Mrs. Harlow was behind the counter, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She was a quiet woman, middle-aged, with hair beginning to silver at the temples. Her eyes, though kind, carried a depth of sadness that Ethan had noticed on his previous visits. There was a calm dignity in the way she moved, a gentle grace that seemed to soften the harshness of the dusty town around her. "Morning, Mrs. Harlow," Ethan said, tipping his hat. His voice was low, roughened by years of wind and sun, but it held a tone of respect. "Morning, Ethan," she replied softly, a small smile touching her lips. "Back for more ammunition, I see." "The herd's getting restless. I'll need enough to last the next few weeks," Ethan said as he approached the shelves lined with boxes of bullets. He ran his hand along the wooden cases, feeling the familiar grooves and edges beneath his fingers. The quiet of the shop wrapped around him like a familiar blanket, a sharp contrast to the wide-open spaces he had left behind on the plains. As he selected the boxes he needed, Ethan noticed Mrs. Harlow speaking quietly to a man browsing the other side of the store. Her voice was soft but urgent, as if she was sharing something that must remain private. Ethan could not catch all of her words, but one phrase stood out clearly: "Must never leave the shop." He frowned slightly, curiosity prickling at the back of his mind. He knew better than to pry, but something about the tone of her voice suggested that this was no ordinary conversation. Ethan paid for his ammunition, placing coins carefully on the counter. The sound of metal against wood echoed in the stillness of the shop. Mrs. Harlow counted the coins with practiced efficiency, her hands steady despite the weight of the day. "Everything in order, Ethan?" she asked, looking up at him with a glance that seemed to measure more than the transaction. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, pocketing the receipt. But before he could leave, his attention was drawn to a corner of the shop where a heavy wooden crate sat half-hidden beneath a cloth. Mrs. Harlow was struggling with it, her movements careful but strained. It was unusual for her to carry anything so large by herself. "Need a hand with that?" Ethan asked, stepping closer. Her eyes widened slightly, a mixture of surprise and relief crossing her face. "Oh, that would be very kind, Ethan. It's heavier than I expected." He could feel the weight of it immediately, the wood solid and unyielding beneath his hands. With a careful lift, he hoisted it off the floor, balancing it against his hip. Mrs. Harlow stepped back, watching him with a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. As he carried the crate toward the back of the shop, Ethan's curiosity grew. What could be so important, so secret, that it needed to be hidden away in a crate? He placed it gently on a sturdy table, careful not to disturb the contents. With a practiced hand, he lifted the cloth covering the top. Beneath it lay an old leather-bound journal, its edges worn and pages slightly yellowed with age. Ethan's eyes widened. The leather was cracked, softened by time, but it radiated a quiet significance. Mrs. Harlow moved closer, her fingers brushing lightly against the journal. "That belonged to my husband," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. It's a private record of things that should remain hidden. Some stories are better left alone." He could see the lines of worry on her face, the way her hands trembled ever so slightly as she held the journal. It was clear that this was not just any book. It held memories, confessions, and secrets, all carefully preserved over the years. "I understand, ma'am," he said quietly. "I won't touch it without your permission. That journal, it's all I have left of him and all I have to protect our family's history." He straightened, setting the journal carefully back in the crate. "I won't let it leave this shop," he promised. "You have my word." He could feel the weight of the leather journal against his hands for a moment, not just physically, but in the sense of responsibility it carried. Then, with a final glance at Mrs. Harlow, he stepped toward the door. The morning sun was brighter now, casting long shadows across the dusty street. Ethan adjusted his hat and mounted his horse, the leather creaking beneath him. As he rode away from the gun shop, he couldn't shake the feeling that this day, ordinary at first glance, had become something much more important. A simple errand had turned into the beginning of a story, one that would test his judgment, his sense of right and wrong, and his understanding of the quiet strength of a woman who had carried a secret alone for far too long. The town of Dry Creek seemed unchanged, its dusty streets and wooden buildings bathed in the golden morning light. Yet for Ethan, everything had shifted slightly. He could feel the weight of unseen stories lingering in the air, whispering questions he wasn't yet ready to answer. And in the back of his mind, he knew that he would return. He had to. Not just for the ammunition he had come for, but for the journal, the widow, and the secrets that had quietly changed the course of his day. For now, the town went about its business. The blacksmith struck iron, the baker placed fresh bread in the window, and the children played in the dust. But behind the doors of the small gun shop, a story waited, a story that had been hidden away and protected. And somewhere along the quiet streets, a cowboy rode, unaware that his ordinary morning had turned into the first chapter of a tale far more extraordinary than he could have imagined. After leaving the gun shop, Ethan could not stop thinking about the leather-bound journal. The sun was higher now, casting a warm glow over the plains as he guided his horse along the winding trail. Normally, his mind would be focused on the cattle, on the fences, on the wide-open field stretching endlessly into the horizon. But today, something felt different. There was a weight, quiet yet persistent, pressing at the edge of his thoughts. The journal misses. Harlow's cautious warning and the strange urgency in her voice kept replaying in his mind. By mid-morning, Ethan arrived at his cabin, a small wooden structure on the outskirts of town. The place was modest but comfortable, a reflection of his simple life. Dusty boots were kicked off by the door, and the brim of his hat was hung on a peg. He leaned against the doorway for a moment, taking a deep breath. The plains stretched out endlessly before him, the wind carrying the faint scent of wildflowers and dry grass. Yet the quiet of his cabin felt more inviting than ever, a space where he could think and perhaps understand the burden of secrets. Despite his better judgment, Ethan found himself returning to the thought of the crate and the journal. He remembered Mrs. Harlow's eyes, the way they had held both fear and trust. There was something about that combination that left him restless. He wondered about the life she had led with her late husband, the stories that might be hidden in the pages of that leather-bound book. His curiosity, carefully restrained until now, began to grow stronger. Late in the morning, after tending to some chores around the cabin, Ethan made a decision. He walked back to the crate in the corner of his cabin. He had carried it there earlier, intending to keep it safe and untouched, but now he felt an almost irresistible pull to open it, just enough to understand the depth of what Mrs. Harlow had been protecting. With careful hands, he lifted the cloth covering the top and slid it aside. The journal lay there, quiet and unassuming, yet it seemed to hum with the weight of its own stories. Ethan traced the worn edges with his fingers, feeling the texture of the cracked leather. The smell of old paper and faint smoke rose from the pages, stirring memories of simpler times when letters and diaries were the only means of preserving a life. With a deep breath, he opened the journal to the first page. The handwriting was neat, looping, and deliberate. It was clear that the author had taken care to write each word with precision, as though aware of the importance of every letter. The first entries were mundane at first, notes about the town, weather, supplies, and daily routines. But soon, Ethan noticed the tone shift. There were mentions of secret meetings, whispers of conflict, and subtle hints of a tension that had long been buried beneath the surface of Dry Creek. Hours passed as Ethan read, unable to tear his eyes away from the journal. Page after page revealed a side of the town he had never known. There were stories of alliances formed and broken, promises that had been made and betrayed, and events that had shaped the lives of the people around him in ways no one spoke about openly. Every entry seemed to pull him deeper, and he realized that the journal was more than a personal record. It was a chronicle of lives intertwined by trust, deception, and unspoken truths. At one point, Ethan came across a passage that made him pause. It described an event from many years ago, a tragedy that had touched Mrs. Harlow personally. Her husband had written about it in a way that conveyed both sorrow and fear. Ethan could almost hear the hushed tones of those involved, the careful steps they had taken to ensure the truth never surfaced. The realization struck him. The journal was not just a record of the past, it was a shield, a way for Mrs. Harlow to protect herself and the people she cared about from a truth that could hurt many. Despite understanding the gravity of the situation, Ethan felt a moral tug at his heart. He had always lived by a simple code of honesty and fairness, a cowboy's sense of right and wrong. Yet here was a situation that challenged everything he believed. Should he respect the widow's wishes and leave the past buried, or should he uncover the truth, risking conflict and hurt? The question weighed heavily on him as he leaned back in his chair, the journal resting on his lap. As evening approached, the sky shifting to shades of amber and purple, Ethan decided to continue reading, page by page, entry by entry. He found stories of hidden kindnesses, of sacrifices made in silence, and of love that had endured despite hardship. There were mentions of people who had been wronged, and others who had suffered quietly, never speaking their pain. Each page deepened his understanding of the town and its people, of the delicate balance between secrecy and survival. By nightfall, Ethan had read enough to feel a profound respect for Mrs. Harlow and her late husband. He realized that the journal was more than a secret, it was a responsibility. It held the power to reveal truths that could heal, but also to hurt if handled carelessly. He understood why Mrs. Harlow had been so protective. Her husband's words were a bridge to a past that was both painful and important, a past that deserved to be honored, not recklessly exposed. Ethan set the journal aside for a moment, stepping outside to look at the stars. The night was quiet, the only sounds the distant calls of coyotes and the rustling of grass in the gentle wind. He felt a connection to the generations that had come before him in Dry Creek, to the stories that had been whispered in secret and now recorded in ink and paper. He realized that every life had layers, every town had hidden stories, and every person carried burdens unseen by others. The cowboy returned inside and carefully placed the journal back in the crate, covering it with the cloth. He made a silent promise to Mrs. Harlow and to himself. He would protect the secret, respect the history, and only intervene if the need was truly pressing. The responsibility weighed on him, but it also gave him a sense of purpose beyond his daily routine. As he settled into bed that night, Ethan could not shake the feeling that his life had subtly shifted. A simple trip to the gun shop had become the start of something much larger. He was no longer just a cowboy tending cattle and moving across the plains. He was a guardian of a story, a keeper of a secret that had the power to change lives. Sleep came slowly, with dreams filled with echoes of the journal's entries, faces of people long gone, whispers of events, and the gentle voice of Mrs. Harlow reminding him of the trust she had placed in him. When morning arrived, Ethan rose with a renewed sense of purpose. He had a job to do, one that went beyond the duties of a cowboy. There were stories to honor, histories to respect, and a widow's secret to carry carefully through a world that might not understand its importance. The day ahead was ordinary at first glance: cattle to tend, fences to check, and supplies to gather. But in the back of his mind, Ethan knew that nothing would ever feel ordinary again. Every step he took across the plains, every conversation he had in Dry Creek, and every glance toward the small gun shop would carry the silent weight of the journal, the lives it represented, and the trust he had been given. As he rode through the fields, Ethan thought about the town and its people, about the quiet strength of those who carried burdens unseen, and about the invisible threads that connected past and present. He understood, in a way he had never understood before, that courage was not always about confrontation or heroics. It was often about patience, understanding, and respect for the lives and stories of others. By the time the sun dipped low in the sky, painting the plains in hues of gold and deep purple, Ethan had made up his mind. He would return to the gun shop soon, not to pry or to satisfy curiosity, but to offer his help and support. The journal, Mrs. Harlow, and the secrets it contained were now a part of his life, and he would carry that responsibility with care, honor, and unwavering respect. The stars appeared one by one as night settled over Dry Creek, the town quiet under a blanket of darkness. Ethan sat outside his cabin, gazing at the sky, feeling the vastness of the plains and the smallness of a single life in the face of history. Yet he also felt something more: a connection, a purpose, and a readiness to face whatever lay ahead. The journey that had begun with a simple errand to buy ammunition had transformed into something far greater, something that required patience, wisdom, and heart. And in the quiet night, with only the wind and the distant calls of nocturnal creatures, Ethan understood that the real journey was just beginning. The following morning, the sun rose slowly over Dry Creek, spreading golden light over the dusty streets and wooden buildings. Ethan mounted his horse, feeling the familiar weight of his saddle and the steady presence of his trusted companion beneath him. But today, his mind was elsewhere. The journal, the stories it held, and the trust Mrs. Harlow had placed in him weighed heavily on his thoughts. The quiet life of a cowboy, which usually brought him peace, now felt more complicated. As he rode toward the open plains, Ethan thought again about the entries he had read the night before. Some passages spoke of betrayal among friends, others of decisions that had hurt innocent people. The journal revealed a past filled with choices made in secrecy, some out of love, some out of fear. Ethan realized that knowing the truth was a gift, but also a burden. He had always believed in honesty, yet here he faced a situation where revealing the truth could cause pain, even while keeping it hidden could feel wrong. Ethan paused at the edge of a ridge overlooking the town. From this height, he could see the main street, the blacksmith's shop, and the familiar shape of Harlow's arms in the distance. The sight made him think of Mrs. Harlow, alone in her shop, carrying the weight of history and of him, now part of that secret without fully choosing it. He understood that some stories were not just about right or wrong. They were about timing, courage, and understanding when to act. Returning to his cabin, Ethan found himself unable to focus on the work of the day. The cattle grazed quietly, the fences needed checking, and the chores piled up, yet he felt restless. His mind kept returning to the journal and the question of what to do with the knowledge it contained. The entries had introduced him to people whose lives had been quietly shattered by events long buried. He wondered if the town even remembered those stories, or if they had faded completely into rumor and silence. That afternoon, Ethan rode back to the gun shop under the pretense of returning a few supplies. He tied his horse outside and stepped into the cool, familiar interior. Mrs. Harlow looked up from the counter, a polite smile crossing her face. "Ethan, good to see you again," she said. "What brings you back today?" He wanted to know more about the journal, the stories it contained, and why it had been so carefully protected. But he also wanted to respect Mrs. Harlow's wishes, understanding that some secrets carried weight far beyond their immediate effect. He realized that this balance between curiosity and respect was at the heart of his dilemma. Later, Ethan returned to his cabin with a heavy heart. He sat on the porch, looking out over the plains as the sun dipped low in the sky. The wind carried the scent of dry grass and distant smoke, and the quiet was broken only by the occasional call of a bird or the soft sound of a horse shifting in its stall. He opened the journal again, carefully this time, knowing that each word he read brought him deeper into the lives and choices of others. The entries revealed hidden acts of bravery, small kindnesses that had changed lives quietly, and sacrifices that went unnoticed. There were also accounts of betrayal and pain, carefully recorded to preserve truth while protecting those involved. Ethan realized that the journal was not just a record, it was a map of human nature, of courage and fear, love and regret, all intertwined in the lives of the town's residents. As he read, Ethan felt a growing sense of responsibility. He understood that he was now part of a story larger than himself. The knowledge he possessed could be used wisely or recklessly, and the choices he made would have consequences. He thought about Mrs. Harlow and the trust she had placed in him. Her husband's words were not just history, they were a call to integrity, a reminder that understanding and compassion mattered as much as truth itself. Days passed, and Ethan continued to balance his work on the plains with his growing sense of duty. He helped with the cattle, repaired fences, and carried out the chores expected of him, all while carrying the weight of the journal in his thoughts. At night, he would sit quietly, reading and reflecting, trying to understand the best way to honor the trust placed in him. One evening, as he returned from checking the cattle, Ethan saw Mrs. Harlow outside her shop, arranging supplies and speaking softly to a child who had wandered in from the street. The sight reminded him of the humanity behind the stories in the journal. These were real people, with real lives and real pain. Each entry he read was a reminder that history was not just about events, it was about the people who lived through them, and the choices they made. Ethan's internal struggle continued to grow. He wanted to help, to make things right where wrong had been done. But he also feared that revealing too much could harm those he cared about, including Mrs. Harlow. The journal had shown him that truth could be dangerous in the wrong hands, and he realized that wisdom was needed to decide when and how to act. One night, a storm rolled over the plains. Lightning lit up the sky, and the wind rattled the cabin's windows. Ethan sat by the fire, the journal open before him. The storm outside seemed to mirror the storm within him. He read of events long past, of conflicts and reconciliations, of mistakes and forgiveness. The journal was a guide, showing him the consequences of actions taken and the importance of careful, thoughtful choices. By the time the storm passed, Ethan had made a decision. He would continue to protect the journal, respecting Mrs. Harlow's wishes, while quietly looking for ways to help where he could. He understood that some changes could not be forced, and that patience, observation, and compassion were as important as action. The journal was not just a record of the past, it was a tool for understanding the present and shaping the future with care. In the following days, Ethan observed the town more closely. He noticed the small ways people interacted, the kindnesses and tensions that mirrored the stories in the journal. He began to see connections he had missed before, realizing that history shaped the present in ways that were often invisible. Every conversation, every gesture, every choice was part of a larger story. Ethan also began to understand Mrs. Harlow better. Her quiet strength, her patience, and her careful protection of the journal revealed a depth of character he had not appreciated before. She had lived through loss and hardship, and yet she continued to act with integrity and compassion. The trust she placed in him was not given lightly, and he knew that his actions would honor or betray that trust. As the days turned into weeks, Ethan's sense of responsibility grew stronger. He continued his work as a cowboy, moving cattle and maintaining the ranch, but his mind was always attentive to the lessons of the journal. He became more aware of the consequences of actions, the hidden struggles of others, and the importance of discretion and care. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, Ethan returned to the cabin with a sense of quiet resolve. The journal rested safely in its crate, and he knew that he would continue to protect it. He also knew that his role in this story was just beginning. The journal had revealed much, but there were still choices to be made, moments of courage to be found, and ways to act with wisdom and compassion. Ethan understood that carrying the knowledge of the journal was not a burden in the usual sense. It was a responsibility that required thought, patience, and care. It was a reminder that truth, justice, and compassion were not always simple or easy, but they were worth pursuing. And in the quiet of the plains, as the stars appeared one by one in the night sky, he felt a sense of purpose he had never felt before. He knew that challenges lay ahead, that moral dilemmas would test his patience and judgment, and that the right course of action would not always be clear. But he was ready. The journal had taught him the value of understanding, the importance of trust, and the power of discretion. It had also shown him that courage was not always about confrontation. It was about integrity, empathy, and the quiet strength to do what was right. As Ethan lay in his cabin that night, listening to the soft sounds of the plains, he felt a quiet determination settle over him. He would protect the journal. He would respect Mrs. Harlow's trust. And he would navigate the complexities of the past and present with care and thoughtfulness. The story was far from over, and he was now an essential part of it. The world outside continued its rhythm, unaware of the secrets hidden in a small gun shop, or the cowboy who carried them carefully in his heart. But Ethan knew, as he drifted into sleep, that the choices he made, guided by patience, understanding, and courage, would shape the course of the story yet to unfold. And he was ready for whatever came next. Days passed like the slow drift of clouds over the plains. Ethan continued his work with the cattle, repairing fences, and tending to the daily chores, yet his thoughts never strayed far from Mrs. Harlow and the journal. The quiet routine of his life, once so comforting, now carried an undercurrent of tension, a sense that each action and word could ripple far beyond what he could see. He understood that the journal was more than a record of the past. It was a living responsibility, demanding patience, discretion, and wisdom. One morning, as the sun spilled golden light across Dry Creek, Ethan rode toward the gun shop once again. His horse's hooves clicked on the wooden planks of the main street as he guided it toward the familiar doorway. The bell chimed softly as he entered. Mrs. Harlow looked up from behind the counter, her eyes brightening slightly at his arrival. There was a quiet warmth in her expression, a mix of relief and gratitude that Ethan recognized immediately. "Good morning, Ethan," she said softly. "You've been busy, haven't you? But I thought I'd check in, see if you needed any help today. You know I'll respect whatever you need. It holds truths that some people in this town might not want remembered. There are mistakes, betrayals, and also courage and kindness that deserve recognition. That's why I want you to help me decide what to do. Some of the truths could change lives, in ways both good and difficult, and I want to handle it the right way." "Then let's take it one step at a time," he said. "We'll be careful and we'll act only when the time is right." They discovered accounts of generosity that had gone unnoticed, acts of courage that had quietly protected others, and mistakes that had caused pain but were never fully understood. With each passage, Ethan and Mrs. Harlow discussed the potential impact of revealing the information, deciding how to honor the past without causing unnecessary harm. As the sun climbed high in the sky, the two of them worked side by side, organizing the journal's contents and making careful notes. It became clear that some truths could safely be shared, stories that celebrated the quiet heroism and integrity of the town's residents. Others were too sensitive, too capable of reopening old wounds, and these they chose to protect, leaving them in the journal's pages for the time being. By late afternoon, Ethan stepped outside, looking at the town that stretched below him. The streets were lively with the sounds of daily life, children laughing as they ran past, the blacksmith hammering at his forge and merchants tending their shops. From this distance, the town seemed ordinary, peaceful, and unchanged. Yet Ethan knew better. Beneath the surface lay layers of history, stories of courage and tragedy, mistakes and redemption. And now he and Mrs. Harlow were entrusted with the delicate task of navigating those stories carefully. The evening brought a quiet calm. Ethan returned to his cabin, the journal safely secured in its crate. He sat on the porch, watching the sun set behind the distant mountains, casting long shadows across the plains. The sky was painted with shades of orange, pink, and purple, reflecting the complexity of the choices he now faced. He thought about Mrs. Harlow, about her strength, and about the trust she had placed in him. He realized that his role was not just to protect the journal, but to honor the life and integrity of the woman who had safeguarded it for so long. Days turned into weeks, and Ethan continued his dual life, cowboy by day, guardian of secrets by night. He found that he could apply the lessons from the journal to his own life, becoming more thoughtful in his decisions, more patient with others, and more aware of the consequences of every action. He began to understand that courage was not always shown through bold deeds or confrontations, but often through restraint, empathy, and the willingness to carry a responsibility quietly, without recognition. One afternoon, a traveler arrived in Dry Creek. He had heard rumors about the journal and the hidden stories of the town. Ethan, anticipating the potential trouble, met the man outside the gun shop. The traveler's questions were probing, his curiosity genuine, yet Ethan remained calm. "Some stories," Ethan said quietly, "are not meant for everyone. They must be handled with care, and they are best left in trusted hands." "I will respect your wishes." One evening, as the town settled into quiet and the stars appeared one by one in the sky, Ethan returned to the gun shop. Mrs. Harlow greeted him with a small smile, relief visible in her eyes. "Thank you," she said softly, "for your help, your care, and your understanding. I don't know what I would have done without you." "You've carried this for a long time," he replied. "I'm just helping where I can. You've done the hardest part already." There was a quiet satisfaction in their work, a sense of order and purpose restored after months of uncertainty and burden. As Ethan stepped outside, the cool night air brushing his face, he felt a deep sense of peace. The plains stretched endlessly before him, bathed in silver moonlight. The town was quiet, secure, and unaware of the delicate balance that had been maintained behind the doors of the small gun shop. Yet Ethan knew that life had changed, not just for him, but for Mrs. Harlow, and for the stories that had been entrusted to them. He mounted his horse, the leather saddle creaking softly beneath him, and guided it along the familiar path back to his cabin. The stars shone brightly above, the constellations a silent witness to the choices, courage, and care that had shaped the course of events. Ethan understood that he had grown, not just as a cowboy, but as a person capable of carrying responsibility, empathy, and respect for the lives of others. In the weeks that followed, Ethan and Mrs. Harlow worked quietly together, balancing the preservation of the past with the needs of the present. They shared some of the journal's stories with the town in small, careful ways, celebrating courage and kindness while keeping the more sensitive truths protected. The town began to notice subtle changes, a renewed sense of respect among neighbors, quiet acts of generosity, and an undercurrent of understanding that had been missing before. Ethan knew that the journal had not only preserved history, but had also guided the future in subtle, meaningful ways. He felt proud of the role he had played, not through bold heroics or confrontation, but through patience, discretion, and careful judgment. He had learned that true courage often meant carrying a burden quietly, making thoughtful choices, and respecting the trust placed in him by others. One night, as he sat on the porch of his cabin, watching the plains under a sky filled with stars, Ethan thought about the journey that had begun with a simple trip to the gun shop. What had started as an ordinary errand had become a life-changing experience, teaching him lessons about trust, responsibility, and the quiet strength of those who carry secrets with care. He felt a deep sense of satisfaction and peace, knowing that he had honored the past while helping shape a better future. The world continued around him. The town of Dry Creek lived its quiet, dusty rhythm, and the plains stretched endlessly into the distance. Yet Ethan's life had been forever changed. He had discovered that heroism was not always about bold deeds or fame, but about integrity, empathy, and the courage to carry the weight of a secret for the good of others. And in the quiet night, with the stars as his witnesses, Ethan understood that he was ready for whatever stories the future might bring.